The air in the meeting house was thin and cold, laced with the scent of damp wool and unspoken accusation. Alara gripped the worn fabric of her skirt, her knuckles white, trying not to hear the whispers that had solidified into a low murmur, now amplified by the silence demanded by the deacon. Grief was a raw wound in her chest, still fresh from burying Thomas only days before, but the stares felt sharper than any physical pain. They were eyes that had watched her life unfold in this small valley, her arrival as a young bride, her quiet years with Thomas, the slow decline of his health. Now those same eyes held suspicion, judgment. Reverend Silas, his face a tight mask of sorrow mixed with something harder, cleared his throat. "Sister Alara." His voice echoed slightly in the hushed room. "The circumstances of Brother Thomas's passing. They have given rise to disquiet." He paused, and the quiet settled like dust. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. Disquiet. It was too mild a word for the poison they were suggesting. She had nursed Thomas, watched him fade, held his hand as he took his last breath. She had mourned him with every fiber of her being. And they dared. A woman, Martha Gable, her face usually soft with feigned sympathy, now sharp and accusing, spoke from the third row. "He wasted away, Reverend. Not like the consumption that took my own man. A different kind of wasting. And she gestured with a trembling finger towards Alara. She was the one who gave him his remedies. Brews from the wilderness." A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembly. The implication hung heavy, suffocating. Not sickness. Something administered. Poison. Alara found her voice, a thin, reedy sound against the weight of their conviction. "I gave him only what the doctor prescribed, and herbs for comfort. He was fading. The sickness took him." Her words felt weak, lost against the granite wall of their belief. They wanted an enemy, a reason for death that wasn't just the harshness of life itself. A widow alone was vulnerable, easy to scapegoat. The sheer injustice of it threatened to crack the fragile shell she had built around her sorrow. Fear, cold and absolute, seized her. What would they do? Where could she go? Alone, with nothing, accused of the gravest sin. The room seemed to tilt, the faces blurring into an indistinct, menacing crowd. Just as Reverend Silas opened his mouth, presumably to deliver some pronouncement of the church's judgment or the town's intent, the heavy oak door at the back of the hall creaked open with a slow, deliberate sound. All heads turned. A figure stood silhouetted against the harsh glare of the late afternoon sun outside. He filled the doorway, broad-shouldered and tall, dust motes dancing in the light around him. He was known to them, though rarely seen within these walls. Reese Thorne, the rancher from the far edge of the valley. A man of few words and solitary habits, regarded with suspicion and not a little fear. He stepped fully into the room, and the whispers died entirely. The silence that followed his entrance was profound, different from the tense quiet before. It was a silence of surprise, of apprehension, of a sudden, inexplicable shift in the valley's predictable order. He did not speak. He simply stood there, letting the weight of his presence settle upon the room, his gaze sweeping slowly over the assembled faces before finally, inexorably, resting on Alara. Reese Thorne's gaze was like the distant mountains, craggy, unreadable, ancient. It held no judgment, no sympathy, only a still, potent observation that seemed to cut through the frantic energy of the room. He remained by the door for a long moment, the only sound his quiet breathing and the settling dust motes in the sunbeams. He was dressed in worn leather and denim, smelling faintly of horse and pine, a stark contrast to the starched collars and dark dresses of the churchgoers. He was an outsider, a wild card in their carefully constructed community. Alara stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs, a strange mix of terror and a flicker of something else, bewilderment, perhaps a desperate, unbidden hope. Why was he here? What did he want? He had barely known Thomas, and had never spoken a word to her. His eyes, when they finally met hers, held a fleeting intensity before shifting to the Reverend. Reverend Silas cleared his throat again, visibly unsettled. Mr. Thorne, this is a private matter concerning Sister Alara and the congregation. His tone was stiff, defensive. Rhys Thorne took a step forward, then another, moving with the slow, deliberate gait of a man accustomed to vast, open spaces. He stopped a few paces into the room, his boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor that seemed loud in the silence. He didn't address the Reverend directly. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, gravelly, and carried an unnerving authority that belied its quiet volume. "Heard tell there was trouble here." Martha Gable, emboldened by her earlier outburst, piped up. "We are discussing the unnatural death of Thomas Croft, his widow here. We suspect foul play." Rhys's eyes, dark and steady, turned to Martha. He didn't glare, didn't scowl. He just looked at her, and Martha seemed to visibly shrink back into her seat. The air grew colder. "Thomas Croft was a good neighbor," Rhys said, his voice still low. "He was ailing for a long time." He paused, letting that simple statement hang in the air, a quiet counterpoint to the frantic accusations. He turned his gaze back to Alara, standing alone and vulnerable in the center of the room. Then he did the unexpected. He walked towards her, past the rows of silent, watching faces. Each step was measured, confident. He stopped beside her, not touching her, but simply standing there, a solid, imposing presence. He turned his back slightly on the assembly, a silent shield. The message was clear. He was aligning himself with her. "She has suffered a loss," he stated, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone. "She deserves peace, not." His gesture encompassed the room, the accusing faces. Reverend Silas seemed to find his voice again. "Mr. Thorne, the law will need to be involved if these suspicions persist. The sheriff will require testimony." Rhys turned his head slightly to look at the Reverend. Testimony based on gossip and fear? He didn't wait for an answer. He looked down at Alara. "Are you finished here, Mrs. Croft?" Alara, still reeling from the abrupt shift, could only nod, tears blurring her vision. She wanted only to escape, to be anywhere but under these eyes. "Then you'll come with me," Rhys said, his tone not a question, but a quiet command. He didn't offer a hand, didn't rush her. He simply turned and began walking back towards the door he had entered through, leaving Alara to follow in his wake. It was an act of audacious defiance against the gathered community, a silent challenge that left the room stunned into deeper silence. Alara, trembling but finding a flicker of resolve in the wake of his unexpected intervention, lifted her chin slightly, straightened her shoulders, and walked with him, leaving the cold judgments and whispers behind her. The air outside was sharp and clean after the suffocating atmosphere of the meeting house. The wind bit at Alara's thin shawl as she walked beside Rhys Thorne towards where a single horse was tethered. He hadn't spoken since they left the building, and she hadn't dared to ask the questions swirling in her mind. Why had he done it? What did he expect from her now? They walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on the gravel path and the distant call of a hawk. He untied the horse, a sturdy bay mare. He mounted smoothly, then offered her his hand, the first physical contact between them. His palm was calloused, his grip firm. Alara hesitated for only a moment, then placed her smaller, trembling hand in his. He pulled her up onto the horse behind him with surprising ease. The mare shifted under their combined weight, and then they were moving, away from the cluster of buildings that made up the town, towards the rugged hills where his ranch lay. The journey was long and silent. Alara held onto his coat, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest as the horse trotted. She watched the familiar landscape recede, replaced by harsher, more isolated terrain. The vastness of the valley unfolded around them, dwarfing the small dramas of human life. She thought of Thomas, buried in the small cemetery they were leaving behind. The grief returned, a dull ache beneath the sharp fear of her current predicament. But there was also a strange sense of liberation, a terrifying freedom in being whisked away from the place that had just condemned her. They reached the ranch as dusk began to paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was a simple, solid structure, built to withstand the elements, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. Smoke curled from the chimney, a sign of life and warmth. Reese dismounted and helped her down, his touch impersonal but steady. He led the horse towards the stable without a word, leaving her standing alone by the cabin door. Hesitantly, Elara approached the door. It wasn't locked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The single room was Spartan but clean. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light and long shadows. A rough table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. A narrow bunk was built into one wall. The air smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, and coffee. It was a scent of survival, of a life stripped down to essentials. Reese entered moments later, closing the door softly behind him. He went straight to the fire, rubbing his hands together. He didn't look at her immediately. "You can stay here," he said finally, his back still to her. "For a while. Until things settle." "Why?" The word was out before she could stop it, whispered into the quiet room. He turned then, his face illuminated by the firelight, making the shadows in his eyes deeper. "It's not right," he said simply. "What they were doing. To you," he didn't elaborate, didn't offer platitudes. His reasoning seemed based on some internal code of justice she couldn't fathom. He didn't ask about Thomas, didn't ask about the accusations. He offered refuge, stark and unadorned. Elara wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cold seep into her bones despite the fire. "They said, they think I poisoned him." Reese looked at her, his expression unreadable. "People talk, especially when they don't understand. Or when they're afraid." He walked to a small cupboard and took out a tin coffee pot. "Are you hungry?" The mundane question, in the face of the day's drama and the looming threat, felt surreal. But her stomach clenched. She hadn't eaten. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible. He nodded, acknowledging her reply without fuss. He moved with quiet efficiency, filling the pot with water from a bucket, adding coffee grounds. He didn't hover, didn't press. He simply allowed her to be there, in his space, offering a silent sanctuary against the storm of judgment she had left behind. Elara watched him, trying to reconcile this quiet competence with the formidable presence he projected. Here, in the simple warmth of his cabin, the terror began to recede, replaced by a weary exhaustion and the faint stirrings of bewildered gratitude towards this solitary man who had intervened on her behalf. Days bled into a week, then 2. Life at Reese Thorne's ranch was a study in quiet routine. Elara settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the small holding. She helped with chores, feeding the chickens, tending the small garden patch, mending fabric. He worked mostly with the horses or mending fences on the vast acreage. They spoke little, their communication mostly confined to practical matters. "Need water from the well?" Or "The mare is limping." Yet, a different kind of understanding grew between them, built on shared silence and observation. Elara watched him from a distance. The way he handled the horses, firm but gentle. The way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. The quiet strength in his movements. He was a man shaped by the unforgiving land, weathered and self-sufficient. He never asked about her life with Thomas, never brought up the accusations from the town. It was a silent agreement to leave the past undisturbed. In turn, she didn't pry into his solitary existence or the reasons for his detachment from the community. Slowly, tentatively, her fear of him began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious respect and a burgeoning sense of safety. The cabin, though simple, became a refuge. The fire in the hearth was a constant comfort against the valley's chill. She still felt the weight of her loss, the sharp pangs of grief for Thomas, but the immediate terror of public accusation receded in the quiet solitude of the ranch. Here, she was simply Elara, a woman who needed shelter, not a pariah. One evening, a storm blew in, rattling the cabin windows and howling down the chimney. Rain lashed against the roof. Elara sat by the fire, mending a tear in her dress, the needle glinting in the firelight. Reese sat at the table, cleaning the action of his rifle. His movements focused and steady despite the storm's fury. The silence was companionable, not strained. "Are you worried?" she asked finally, her voice low. "About them coming here." Reese finished cleaning a part of the rifle before looking up. His eyes met hers across the fire. "They know I don't take kindly to trespassers." His tone was matter-of-fact, not boastful. "They talk. That's their way. But they are less eager to act unless they are in a group. And out here, a group would be seen long before they arrived." His quiet confidence was reassuring. It wasn't just the distance from town that protected her. It was him. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. He looked back at his rifle. No need. It was the right thing to do. That was the extent of his explanation. Simple, direct. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a man doing what was right. The days continued, marked by the changing light, the rhythm of the chores. Alara felt a slow strengthening within herself. The vulnerability that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death began to lessen. She stood taller, her movements gained purpose. She had survived the worst day, found an unexpected protector in the wilderness, and was slowly rebuilding herself, piece by piece, in the quiet eye of the storm. One afternoon, while she was hanging laundry on the line, she saw a rider approaching in the distance. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was too early for Reese to be back from checking the far fences. As the rider drew closer, she recognized him. It was Sheriff Brody, a grim-faced man who upheld the law with rigid impartiality. He represented the external world she had fled. She froze, her hand clutching a wet sheet, the wind whipping her hair around her face. This was it. They had come for her. She turned and ran towards the cabin, towards the only safety she knew. She burst into the cabin, breathless. "Sheriff Brody. He's coming." Reese was by the fire, sharpening a knife. He didn't jump up, didn't show panic. He finished the stroke, tested the edge with his thumb, then laid the knife down deliberately. "All right." He went to the door and stepped outside, standing by the frame, waiting. Alara watched from the doorway, her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles white. The sheriff rode up, dismounted, his expression unreadable. "Thorn," Brody said, his voice neutral. "Sheriff," Reese replied. Brody looked past Reese, his gaze finding Alara in the doorway. "Mrs. Croft, I need to speak with you." Alara felt the familiar surge of fear, the cold dread. But this time it was different. It wasn't paralyzing. She was standing in Reese Thorne's cabin on his land. She had spent weeks here, finding a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't the same cowering woman from the meeting house. Reese didn't move, remaining a silent, solid barrier. "She's been staying here," he said, his voice low, "getting her strength back." Sheriff Brody's eyes flickered between Reese and Alara. He was aware of Reese's reputation, his independence. He was also aware of the accusations that had flown around town. "The folk in town are still talking, Thorne, about Thomas Croft's death. Questions remain." "Questions based on fear," Reese stated, repeating the words he had used in the meeting house. Alara stepped forward, standing beside Reese in the doorway, meeting the sheriff's gaze directly. "I nursed my husband, Sheriff. I did not harm him." Her voice was steady, stronger than she expected. The fear was still there, a hum beneath her skin, but it no longer controlled her. She stood on solid ground, both literally and figuratively. Sheriff Brody looked at Alara, seeing not just a frightened widow, but a woman standing with quiet defiance beside a man known for his formidable self-reliance. He saw the simple cabin, the well-tended property, a life lived honestly out here on the edge. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the valley. He understood the difference between malicious gossip born of fear and a true crime. He looked at Reese, saw the unyielding posture, the silent readiness. He sighed, a small sound in the vastness of the landscape. "The doctor's report was inconclusive," Brody admitted. "But the talk is cruel." Alara finished for him, her voice clear. My husband was ill. He faded. It was the way of things. Sheriff Brody studied her face, searching for guilt, finding only sorrow and a quiet determination. He looked back at Reese, who simply waited, a silent challenge in his stillness. The law needed proof, not just the baying of a fearful crowd. Out here, away from the town's suffocating judgment, the truth seemed simpler, starker. "There's no evidence, Mrs. Croft," Brody said finally, his tone less accusatory, more weary. "Only suspicion." Without evidence, he let the sentence trail off. "I'll inform the town." He mounted his horse, the message clear. The accusations, unsupported by proof, could not stand against the quiet reality he found here, or the unspoken protection offered by Reese Thorne. He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture of respect, perhaps, or just acknowledgement of their shared understanding. Then he turned his horse and rode away, back towards the valley and the town that had cast her out. Alara watched him go, a shaky breath escaping her lips. It wasn't a formal exoneration. The accusations might never fully die in the valley's gossip, but it was an end to the immediate threat, a validation of her truth. She turned back to Reese, standing silently beside her. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of rain and dust. "He's gone," she stated, unnecessary but true. Reese nodded. He didn't say, "You're safe." He didn't say, "I protected you." He simply looked at her. A slow, steady gaze that held a depth she was only beginning to understand. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. This time, it was more than just gratitude for shelter. It was thanks for quiet strength, for unspoken support, for seeing her when others chose only to see their fears. He didn't dismiss her thanks this time. He just nodded again, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "The storm's passed," he said, looking out at the clearing sky. The storm of judgment, perhaps, not just the one outside. Alara looked out at the valley, spread out below them, the sun breaking through the clouds, painting the wet earth in golden light. She had lost much. Her husband, her place in the community, her sense of safety. But she had found something too. Resilience she hadn't known she possessed. A quiet strength forged in isolation and hardship. And she had found an unexpected ally in this solitary man. She didn't know what the future held. Life would continue hard and demanding. The valley remained unforgiving. But she was no longer alone, and she was no longer afraid in the same way. Standing beside Reese Thorne, a quiet partnership forged in shared solitude and unspoken understanding, Alara Croft, the accused widow, felt a sense of quiet dignity return, a resilient hope rising like the sun after the storm. They faced the horizon together, two solitary figures against the vast landscape, ready for whatever came next.